Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge Brett and Belinda Beasley in the gallery and all of their family. I can only imagine how difficult it is to listen to the debate on such a sensitive issue, but to thank them and to once again pass our respect to them for their amazing stoicism, their amazing strength and courage in the championing of these laws and the continued fight to see laws that strengthen and help prevent the tragedy that their son experienced, their son Jack Beasley. And unfortunately, so many others have experienced or have been at threat of experiencing. And I also wish to acknowledge that this legislation also particularly notes that the tragic death also of Raymond Harris, who died in September 2020 after being fatally stabbed on Cavill Avenue, Surfers Paradise. And while the death of Baylen Stewart last year on the Sunshine Coast wasn't within a safe night precinct, it was from a knife, and it was from a weapon where he was stabbed, and the tragedy is that he is no longer with us. It just beggars belief that these types of crimes have been increasing in nature and apparently in severity. And as we have already acknowledged, the LNP supports these laws, supports Jack's law and measures to ensure that the police have their tools at hand, legal tools, to be able to address this terrible scourge in our community where people have been carrying weapons such as knives, and as has been mentioned, it is more extensive than knives. It can be screwdrivers, there might be other things that they're carrying. And it has become necessary to have these measures where police are able to they're able to have handheld scanners to tell whether people are carrying these particular weapons. And in this case, under the legislation, it's in defined areas. The legislation before the House is to expand upon the trial which started on the Gold Coast, but it will see it extend into other safe night precincts and also transport hubs on public transport, because it's been recognised that this is beyond just a few areas. I strongly support the expansion of these laws into other areas, into other safe night precincts, and certainly with our public transport nodes and on public transport. And there is a disagreement between us and the government on this, and I respect the the member who spoke just before me, the member for Cooper, and I respect that there are different views about why this legislation should be trialled for another couple of years or why it should be made permanent. I support my colleague, the member for Burdekin, and the Shadow Minister for Police, who has put forward amendments to get rid of the sunset on this legislation, because we believe there has been adequate evidence, but there's also built into adequate evidence that it has significantly assisted with the confiscation of, I believe, about 242 weapons have been confiscated. There may have been more. But it's also a deterrent that this legislation has, that we will never know how many people have chosen not to take weapons into these areas, because they know now that there is a real risk, if you like, to them of being apprehended, of those weapons being apprehended. And why do they have to carry these? If people aren't carrying them, there's nothing to fear from the act of the law of wanting them. It's really about providing that public safety benefit to our whole community by knowing that these measures are there. The police have the tools to do the job. And that's why we have proposed, under my colleague, the member for Burdekin and the LNP, to get rid of the sunset in this legislation, ensure that the legislation continues on. But there is a review mechanism in there, and I want to emphasise this because, with respect to members opposite who want to allow the sunset provisions to remain in the legislation, we are talking about having a requirement for legislative provisions to be reviewed. That's in our amendments, but we don't have a sunset on the legislation, and that's very important. It's not uncommon in legislation to have legislative review mechanisms without having a sunset on those pieces of legislation. And it would be unfortunate to have the uncertainty with these laws potentially going out of the statute books in 2 years' time because the government is determined to maintain a sunset on them and keep it uncertain at this time. I want to talk about safe night precincts, and I am a strong advocate of this mechanism, and certainly under the LNP when we were in government, we established a means of being able to fund and resource and have a structure around these areas, these entertainment precincts where alcohol is consumed, people are out for a good time, you want them to have a good time, but to go home safe and be safe when they're in these places. I am very disappointed that the state Labor government has removed dedicated funding for police, additional police in these safe night precincts. And certainly, as we see these laws with Jack's Law and being rolled out, and the ongoing need for existing laws to be applied in these areas, we need the police who are also available there to enforce them. We need the police there to ensure that it's not just black-letter law. There is actually a real police presence to ensure those laws can be implemented. And it is really disturbing when we start to hear about the lack of police resources, actual police on the beat in our communities because they are stretched so thin. And with the removal of that additional funding and dedicated funding for police resources, in our safe night precincts, it was a backward step. I really believe that. That was a backward step. These are often the hot spots where crimes occur, when people are under the influence of liquor and other substances. And unfortunately, those who can be the victims of crime aren't the ones who have gone out with the intention of committing a crime. They have become the victims of other people's excesses, and we need to make sure that they are safe. So I would urge the government to reverse their decision to remove this dedicated additional funding for police in our safe night precinct. As these laws are rolled out, I know that talking to my local hospitality centres around safe night precincts, they're very, very keen on these measures, very keen to see, as are the police, to see what support is provided with additional training and resources so they can do their job. But once again, I urge the government to put back the funds they took away that were dedicated for the police to be able to do their job to keep these areas as safe as possible. This work is never finished. It's ongoing. And to see the resources removed is a backward step, particularly at a time when we're seeing new laws come through that need to be backed up with actual dedicated resources as well to ensure that they are as safe as possible. I want to talk also about Maroochydore Bus Station, which is the main bus hub, public transport hub on the coast, on the Sunshine Coast. There have been a lot of incidents there. I know the police are trying as best as possible and other security to keep it as safe as possible. But once again, this is right near the Safe Night Precinct, but it will also be incorporated and enable police to want to scan people for potentially carrying knives. But we need to see those more police resources in place. They're doing a tough job, but we need to ensure that their presence isn't undermined by lack of real resources. We need to ensure that these laws aren't undermined by lack of resources, to ensure that the training is there, the police numbers are there, and there is the awareness how these laws are to be applied. There also needs to be education publicly about these laws, because that is really a huge benefit where you're able to not only resource the police and the job that they're doing, but ensure that all of our community is aware that this issue of knives is just not okay, or any weapons being carried onto our streets, carried into public transport, carried anywhere, even if it's not captured by the Wanding laws and it's outside of these precincts. It's not okay. There is no reason for people to be carrying weapons because it already goes to some sense of intent. If they're carrying it, why are they carrying it? It's not for good, and it's time that we really stood up against this more effectively across our community.